The year is 63 A.D., when Paul's final journey begins after the conclusion of the book of Acts. Sometimes this is called Acts 29. Paul will remain free until about 65 or 66 A.D. There is considerable speculation about the sequence of events, but most of the destinations are agreed upon: Colossi, perhaps Spain, Corinth, Meletis, Troas, Crete, Nicopolis, Philippi, Ephesus, and Macedonia. Speculation areas are 1. The trip to Spain, 2. A second visit to Meletis, and 3. The trip to Colossi. I'll assume 1 and 3 and present 1 trip to Meletis. While in Rome, Paul appeared before Nero sometime during his house arrest, and God had promised Paul in a vision in Acts 27:24 that he would stand before Caesar, and so he was safe until then. Paul was acquitted by Nero, and you can see Paul expecting to be released in Philemon 22 and perhaps in Philippians 1:19-26. When Paul was released, it was assumed he made his way to the coastal port of Rome called Ostia, which has many ruins yet remaining today. The ruins of this Roman port are now a long ways away from the current shoreline due to the silt of the river filling the banks over the past 2,000 years. From Ostia, he caught a ship probably to Corinth. Timothy, Titus, and likely Trophimus accompanied him on this trip. Once passage was secured, likely to Corinth, a major destination from this Roman port, though it was a 760-mile journey, at about 4 to 5 miles an hour speed for a sailing vessel, this would take between 10 and 30 days depending on the weather. From Corinth, Paul likely secured passage to Meletis, a major port of southwestern Asia, and the greatest Greek city in the east for the Romans. The ruins of ancient Meletis are 5 to 6 miles distance from the present-day Aegean shore due to the Meander River dumping its silt and filling in the Delta Valley. In Paul's day, it was surrounded by water with 4 ports and a major seafaring commercial and intellectual capital. The theater at Meletis could seat 15,000, and ships could dock right in front of the theater. Trophimus, unfortunately, became too sick to travel any further, according to 2 Timothy 4:20. At the time he wrote these words, when he was back in Rome. Paul apparently still did not know what had become of Trophimus. Paul thus left Trophimus behind in Meletis. Some contend that this implies a second trip to Meletis, but the chronology becomes difficult to piece together. From Meletis, Paul could have visited the Ephesians, leaving Timothy while going on to Colossi, another 120-mile trek from the coast. Paul had planned to visit Philemon. In Philemon 22, prepare me a lodging, he requested. In Colossi, so it seems highly likely that he made it in a 6 to 7 day walk. Colossi was one of the major cities in Galatia and Phrygia that were populated by Antiochus the Great, or Antiochus III, by 2,000 Jewish families from Babylon and Mesopotamia, according to Josephus. The city would be destroyed by earthquake, and it has never been excavated to this day. After a brief stay in Colossi, Paul left Timothy in Ephesus and with his team walked 280 miles to Troas, where Paul left his winter coat and some parchments and books, which he later asked Timothy to bring with him to Rome, when he writes, "Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books and especially the parchments." 2 Timothy 4:13. Since Paul left his cloak, we may infer that it was summer or nearing summer as they passed this way. The ruins at Troas are extensive, whose importance stemmed from the quarry where many columns were excavated for the public buildings throughout the empire. It appears that Paul here met Titus, and soon they departed Troas for Crete. They apparently started at one end of the island of Crete and evangelized across the island to the opposite side before Paul sails north for Macedonia, leaving Titus temporarily on Crete to organize the churches and appoint elders in every city, according to Titus 1:5, implying that they had recently evangelized these towns. Sailing to Macedonia, his intent was to revisit Philippi, as seen in his prison epistle, quote, "I am confident in the Lord that I too will be coming to see you soon." Philippians 2:24. Also, you can see this in 1:26. This would be his first stop in Macedonia on this final voyage. Paul sensed urgency for the unity of the churches when he wrote, quote, "Everyone in the province of Asia deserted me, including Phygellus and Hermogenes," in 2 Timothy 1:15, implying that he had just been there. Paul would make his way to Macedonia by landing at Philippi and then work his way down to Corinth, from which he wrote Timothy, quote, "As I urged you when I was leaving for Macedonia, stay on in Ephesus," 1 Timothy 1:3. He realized he would not return to Ephesus in the near future, according to Ephesians 3:14-15, implying that Paul had already been to Ephesus and was returning to Macedonia, from which he would write 1 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and all with suggestions that he had already been to Ephesus, Crete, and Colossi. This chronology fits because Titus was left in Crete. Quote, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remains in order and appoint elders in every town," Titus 1:5. Also, since Corinth was a shipping hub, Paul could easily send his epistles to Crete for Titus, according to Titus 3:12, and to Ephesus for Timothy, while making plans to winter together in Nicopolis. The few other hints give us a rough sketch of his travels before he is arrested again and returned to Rome. Paul sent Artemas and Tychicus to relieve Titus on Crete, an action Paul hoped would make a way for Titus to join him during the winter months in Nicopolis, according to Titus 3:12. Paul left Erastus in Corinth, 2 Timothy 4:20, and Erastus stayed in Corinth as he was a government official, according to Romans 16:23. Then he headed west and north towards Nicopolis, where he hoped Titus and Timothy would join him, along with possibly others, for a period of rest and planning. If this happened, Timothy returned to Ephesus and Titus to Crete, following the trip to Nicopolis. Nicopolis was a center hub of all east-west traffic. If Paul made it to Spain, now would be a good time for that to happen. His aspiration to travel to Spain have been evident from 5 or more years before. Romans 1, verse 10, 15-24, and verse 28, and 16, 1, 3, and 5. If we eliminate the journey to Spain, my suggestion is that Paul was perhaps arrested in Nicopolis. If he was in fact arrested soon after he arrived at Nicopolis, as winter was setting on, and before Timothy could arrive, this would explain why Paul found himself in prison in the winter in Rome in 2 Timothy 4:13 and 21 without his winter clothing. Or if he made it to Spain and spent the summer and fall there before being arrested and then returned to Rome as winter was beginning, he would now need his coat. In Rome, in the maritime prison, around the time that Nero started to unleash a horrific wave of persecution against the Christians in Rome, during his time in prison, Paul was visited by Onesiphorus, 2 Timothy 1, 16 and 17, abandoned by many Christians as he faced trial, according to 2 Timothy 4:16, deserted by Demas in 2 Timothy 4:10, but still somehow found a way to write a second letter to Timothy. Paul was aided by the physician Luke, who sought to attend to his needs, according to 2 Timothy 4:11. After traveling more than 15,000 miles, almost 9,000 of those by land, enduring 4 shipwrecks, starting churches among 7 or 8 different people groups, perhaps as many as 10, writing 15 letters that we know of, 13 of which are found in the New Testament, enduring multiple imprisonments and uncounted beatings, he ended his life almost alone. According to 2 Timothy, his last days were spent short on time, according to 4 verse 9, cold, 4:13, lonely, 4:11, rejected by his own spiritual children, 1:15, and abandoned by his sons in the faith, 4:10, and betrayed by someone he trusted, 4:14. Nevertheless, in spite of so few that stood with him in the end, he was successful. Chapter 4, verse 6 through 8. Paul is believed to have been beheaded rather than thrown to the wild beast or killed in some other inhumane way because he was a Roman citizen. Tradition supplies only a few facts of the death of the Apostle Paul, which may be true or not. The story is that Paul was beheaded on the Ostian Road. It was customary for criminals of prominence to be executed several miles out of the city so as to avoid the crowds. One day in the late spring or early June, the executors came to Paul's dungeon and led him out of the city. Tradition says that a Roman matron named Lucina buried the body of Paul on her own land, beside the Ostian Road. We still only know part of the story, but someday we'll hear Jesus tell Paul's story before the host of heaven, according to 1 Corinthians 4:5. Then shall every man have his praise from God. And what a day that will be.